The prairie wind carried a secret as it swept across the open Montana landscape, whispering through the tall grass where Quinn Albright hammered fence posts into the unyielding earth, his weathered hands working with mechanical precision, while his heart remained as closed as his lips. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new life had drawn him to this remote stretch of land, miles from the nearest town of Whitehorn, where memories couldn't find him and silence was his only companion. The rhythmic sound of his hammer striking metal stakes had become the heartbeat of his days since purchasing the struggling cattle ranch 3 months prior. The property needed everything repairs to the cabin, new corrals for livestock, and miles of fence line to mark his boundaries. Quinn had taken on each task with the same determined silence that had become his trademark, speaking only when absolutely necessary and never about himself. He was driving the last post of the day into the ground when he sensed her presence before he saw her. Turning slowly, he spotted a woman approaching on foot across the field, her dark green dress billowing slightly in the breeze. She carried something in her arms, and Quinn straightened, pushing back his hat to get a better look. "Mr. Albright," she called as she drew closer. "I'm Madeline Owens. My father owns the mercantile in town." Quinn nodded once in acknowledgement, waiting for her to explain her presence on his land. "I've brought the nails you ordered last week," she said, holding out a cloth sack. "Father couldn't spare the wagon today, and I thought you might need these right away to continue your work." He stared at her, confused why Miss Owens would walk the 5 miles from town carrying a heavy sack of nails. She was nothing like he'd expected the merchant's daughter to be. In his few visits to the mercantile, he'd heard townsfolk mention Old Man Owens and his beautiful daughter, but he'd never crossed paths with her before. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical style, though a few strands had escaped to frame a face that showed both gentle beauty and stubborn determination. "You walked all this way?" he finally asked, his voice rough from disuse. "I don't mind the exercise," she replied with a slight smile. "Besides, I was curious about your ranch. People in town talk, you know." Quinn returned to hammering, hoping she would take the hint and leave after delivering the nails. Instead, she set the sack down nearby and began examining his fence line. "You've done good work here," she observed, running her fingers along a post. "Straight as an arrow." He grunted in response, continuing his work. The last thing he needed was company, especially from a woman who would expect conversation. Madeline walked toward the pile of supplies nearby and asked, "Do you have another hammer?" Quinn paused mid-swing, turning to look at her with disbelief. "What for?" "Well, if I'm going to help, I'll need a hammer, won't I?" She was already rolling up her sleeves, revealing forearms stronger than he would have expected from a merchant's daughter. "You're not helping," he said flatly. "It's not women's work." Her eyebrows rose. "Is that so? My father raised me alone after Mother died." "There's not much I haven't done, Mr. Albright, including building fences." Before he could protest further, she discovered a second hammer in his toolbox and picked up a handful of nails from the sack she'd brought. Without waiting for permission, she moved to the next section of fence and began working. Quinn watched in stunned silence as she positioned a rail and expertly drove a nail through it with 3 precise strikes. When she finished, she looked up at him with a challenging expression. "Are you going to stand there all day, or shall we finish this section before sundown?" Something stirred in Quinn that he hadn't felt in years, a reluctant admiration. With a slight shake of his head, he returned to his work, and they labored side by side as the afternoon sun moved across the sky. For an hour, they worked in silence broken only by the sound of hammers against nails and wood. Quinn found himself stealing glances at Madeline, noting the efficient way she moved and the concentration in her expression as she worked. Her assistance was actually speeding the process, though he'd never admit it aloud. "Why did you really come out here, Miss Owens?" he finally asked. She paused, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "Truth be told, I was concerned. You've been in town nearly 3 months and nobody knows a thing about you. You hardly speak 10 words when you come for supplies. I value my privacy." "There's privacy, and then there's isolation," she replied. "Even out here, a man needs neighbors he can count on." Quinn drove a nail with more force than necessary. "I don't need anyone. Everyone needs someone, Mr. Albright, whether they admit it or not." She resumed her work, adding, "Besides, I was curious what kind of man buys the old Peterson place when everyone knows it's the hardest land to work in the county." Quinn remained silent, unwilling to explain that he'd chosen this property precisely because it would demand all his physical strength and concentration, leaving him too exhausted at day's end to think about all he'd lost. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the newly built fence, Quinn realized they had completed twice the distance he would have managed alone. Madeline set down her hammer and flexed her fingers, which were reddened from the work but showed no blisters. "You've done this before," he observed. "I told you I had," she smiled. "My father may run the mercantile, but we have a small homestead outside town. We couldn't afford hired help when I was growing up." Quinn nodded, then remembered his manners. "Thank you for the help, and the nails." "You're welcome." She hesitated, then added, "It's a long walk back to town. I don't suppose I'll hitch up the wagon," he said quickly, embarrassed he hadn't offered immediately. As they rode toward town in the fading light, Quinn kept his eyes on the road ahead, while Madeline seemed content to enjoy the peaceful evening. The silence between them was surprisingly comfortable. "Will you be at the town social on Saturday?" she asked suddenly. Quinn frowned. "I don't socialize." "It might do you good," she suggested. "Meet some of your neighbors, hear the local gossip." "Not interested in gossip," she sighed. "Everyone will be there. Even the most dedicated ranchers take a night off occasionally." Quinn didn't respond, and Madeline didn't press further. When they reached the edge of town, she directed him to a modest house behind the mercantile. "Thank you for the ride," she said as he helped her down from the wagon, "and for letting me help today." Quinn nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Good evening, Miss Owens." As he turned the wagon to leave, she called after him, "I ride out to check our fence lines every Wednesday, Mr. Albright. Perhaps our paths will cross again." He gave no response, but as he made the solitary journey back to his ranch, Quinn found himself thinking about Wednesday and wondering if Madeline Owens would keep her word. True to her promise, Madeline appeared the following Wednesday, riding a sturdy brown mare across Quinn's south pasture. He was repairing a section of roof on his barn when he spotted her approaching. Setting down his tools, he climbed down the ladder and walked toward her as she dismounted. "Good afternoon, Mr. Albright," she called cheerfully, tying her horse to a post. "I see you've been busy." Quinn nodded, noting that she wore practical riding clothes today, a split skirt and sturdy boots. "Miss Owens." "Madeline, please. If we're to be neighbors, we might as well use first names." He hesitated before responding. "Quinn." She smiled at this small victory. "I brought you something." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped package. "Fresh bread from this morning, and preserves." The gesture caught him off guard. It had been years since anyone had brought him homemade food. "That's kind of you. It's what neighbors do," she said simply. Looking up at the barn, she added, "That roof looks like a two-person job." Before Quinn could protest, she was rolling up her sleeves again. I'm quite good with a hammer, as you've seen, and I'm not afraid of heights. For a moment, he considered refusing her help, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the genuine interest in her eyes, or the fact that the roof repairs would indeed go faster with an extra pair of hands. "Have you eaten today?" he asked instead. When she shook her head, he gestured toward the cabin. "We could have some of that bread first." They sat at his rough-hewn table, sharing the bread and preserves. Quinn found himself answering her questions about the ranch and his plans for it, speaking more words at once than he had in months. She listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "You know cattle," she observed as he explained his breeding plans. "Raised on a ranch in Colorado," he admitted. "My father taught me. Is your family still there?" Quinn's expression closed immediately. "No." Madeline seemed to sense the shift in his mood and changed the subject. "The Peterson place has always had good water. That spring in the north pasture never runs dry, even in the worst droughts." Relief washed over him at her perceptiveness. As they finished eating, Quinn found himself curious about her. "You said your father raised you alone. What happened to your mother?" "Fever took her when I was 8, Madeline replied. "Father never remarried. It's been just the two of us since then." "That must have been difficult." "It was at times, but we managed." She smiled slightly. "Father taught me everything he thought a person should know, regardless of whether it was considered proper for a young lady." After their meal, they worked together on the barn roof until late afternoon. Quinn was impressed by Madeline's competence and lack of complaint about the hard work. As the sun began to lower in the sky, he insisted on escorting her back to town. "That's not necessary," she protested. "I've made the ride alone plenty of times." "It'll be dark soon," he countered. "I'll saddle my horse." They rode side by side through the gathering dusk, the silence between them more companionable than Quinn had experienced with anyone in a long time. At the edge of her property, he stopped. "Thank you for your help today," he said formally. Madeline studied him in the fading light. "You know, Quinn, whatever happened before you came here, it doesn't have to define who you are now." His jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're a man who works hard and treats his animals well. I know you build straight fences and fix things properly instead of taking shortcuts." Her voice softened. "And I know loneliness when I see it." Before he could respond, she turned her horse toward home. "Good night, Quinn Albright. I'll see you next Wednesday." As he watched her ride away, Quinn felt something shift inside him, a tiny crack in the wall he'd built around himself. The following Wednesday brought rain, and Quinn didn't expect Madeline to appear. He was surprised when a knock came at his door in the late morning. Opening it, he found her standing on his porch, rainwater dripping from her oilskin coat. "You came in this weather?" he asked, ushering her inside. "I said I would, didn't I?" She removed her coat and hung it near the fire. "Besides, I brought something that couldn't wait." From her bag, she produced a letter. "This came for you at the post office. Father noticed it yesterday." Quinn took the envelope, recognizing the handwriting immediately. His brother's. The only family he had left. He set it on the table, unwilling to open it in front of Madeline. "Thank you for bringing it," he said stiffly. Madeline seemed to sense his discomfort. "I should head back before the rain gets worse." "Stay," Quinn said, surprising himself. "At least until it lets up. I was about to make coffee." She agreed, and they spent the afternoon talking while the rain drummed against the roof. Quinn found himself telling her about his plans for the spring cattle drive, the new breeding stock he hoped to acquire, even sharing some of the knowledge his father had passed down about predicting weather from the behavior of animals. "You speak of your father with respect," Madeline observed. "You must have been close." Quinn nodded, the familiar pain of loss washing over him. "He was a good man, taught me everything important, and your mother died when I was young like yours." He hesitated, then added, "My brother Daniel and I were raised by our father until he passed 3 years ago." "Is Daniel the one who wrote to you?" she asked gently. Quinn looked at the unopened letter on the table. "Yes. You haven't opened it?" "No." Madeline didn't press further, and Quinn was grateful. Instead, she told him about her father's store, the challenges of ordering inventory 6 months in advance, and her dream of expanding their small business. "Father wants me to marry and settle down," she confided. "He worries what will happen to me when he's gone." "And what do you want?" Quinn asked. "To make my own choices," she replied simply. "To build something that's mine." When the rain finally subsided, Quinn insisted on riding with her back to town. As they neared her home, she turned to him. "The town social is this Saturday," she reminded him. "You should come." Quinn shook his head. "I'm not much for crowds." "Just think about it," she said with a smile. "It might surprise you." Saturday evening found Quinn standing outside the town hall, debating whether to enter. The sounds of music and laughter drifted through the open windows, and he almost turned to leave when someone called his name. "Mr. Albright, you came." It was Mr. Owens, Madeline's father, approaching with a friendly smile. Come in, come in. Let me introduce you around." Before Quinn could protest, the older man had guided him inside. The hall was decorated with lanterns and wildflowers, and nearly everyone in town seemed to be present. Quinn nodded politely as Mr. Owens introduced him to various townspeople, all curious about the silent newcomer who had taken on the Peterson place. His eyes searched the room until he found Madeline, dancing with a young man Quinn didn't recognize. She was wearing a blue dress that made her eyes shine, and her hair was arranged in a style more elaborate than he'd seen before. Something tightened in his chest at the sight of her laughing as her partner spun her around. When the dance ended, she spotted him and made her way through the crowd. "Quinn, you came." Her smile was radiant. "I did," he admitted, "though I'm not sure why." "To dance, of course," she said, holding out her hand as the musicians began a new tune. "Do you know how? It's been a while," he confessed. "It's like riding a horse," she assured him. "Your body remembers." Taking her hand, Quinn led her onto the dance floor. At first, he moved stiffly, acutely aware of the eyes watching them. But gradually, as they circled the floor, the familiar steps came back to him, and he found himself relaxing into the music and the feel of Madeline in his arms. "You dance well for a man who lives alone on a ranch," she observed with a smile. "My mother insisted we learn," he explained. "Said no son of hers would be without manners, ranch or no ranch." She sounds wise. She was. As the evening progressed, Quinn found himself enjoying the company more than he'd expected. Several of the local ranchers approached him with offers of help if he needed it, and genuine interest in his plans for his property. By the time he escorted Madeline home, he felt a connection to the community he hadn't anticipated. At her door, she turned to him. "Thank you for coming tonight. I know it wasn't easy for you." "It was. Less difficult than I expected," he admitted. Madeline studied his face in the moonlight. "Quinn, whatever happened before you came here, my wife and daughter died," he interrupted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Diphtheria." 2 years ago. Madeline's expression softened with compassion. "I'm so sorry." "I couldn't save them," he continued, his voice raw. "I was away on a cattle drive. By the time I got the news and returned home, they were already gone. Sarah was 23. Emma was 4. Madeline reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "It wasn't your fault. I should have been there." "Would it have changed anything?" Quinn swallowed hard. "No, but they wouldn't have died alone." "Is that why you came here, to be alone like they were?" The insight struck him like a physical blow. Was that what he'd been doing all these months, punishing himself? I don't know, he admitted. Maybe. Madeline squeezed his hand. Thank you for telling me, Quinn nodded, unable to speak further. With a gentlemanly bow, he took his leave, riding home through the quiet night with thoughts more turbulent than they had been in months. The next morning, Quinn finally opened his brother's letter. Daniel wrote that he was considering coming to Montana for a visit, wanting to see Quinn's new home and make sure he was truly all right. After reading it twice, Quinn sat at his table and wrote a reply, inviting his brother to come whenever he could manage the journey. When Wednesday came, Quinn found himself watching the horizon, wondering if Madeline would appear. When she did, riding across his south pasture as she had before, he felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. I thought we might work on that corral today, she called as she dismounted. Unless you have other plans, Quinn smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange on his face after so long. The corral sounds good. They fell into a pattern over the following weeks. Every Wednesday, Madeline would ride out to Quinn's ranch, and they would work side by side on whatever project needed attention. Sometimes they talked, sharing pieces of their lives and dreams. Other times they worked in comfortable silence, each taking satisfaction in the progress they made together. Spring brought new calves to Quinn's growing herd, and Madeline was there for the first birth, her capable hands helping when one calf presented with difficulty. As they watched the newborn take its first wobbly steps, Quinn found himself watching Madeline instead, struck by the joy in her expression. "You love this life, don't you?" he asked. "The ranch, the animals." "I do," she admitted. "More than town life, if I'm being honest. Father never understood my preference for open spaces. And yet you stayed to help him," she nodded. "He needed me after Mother died. The store is his life." "What about your life, Madeline?" Quinn asked quietly. "What do you want it to be?" She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "I want purpose, connection, to build something lasting." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. In May, Daniel Albright arrived for his promised visit. Quinn introduced him to Madeline when she came for her Wednesday visit, and Daniel raised his eyebrows knowingly at his brother after she left. "She's something special," Daniel observed. "She is," Quinn agreed, unwilling to elaborate further, "and she clearly cares for you." Quinn busied himself with the dinner preparations. "We're friends," Daniel laughed. "If you say so, but I haven't seen you look at anyone that way since Sarah." The mention of his late wife's name didn't bring the usual stab of pain, Quinn realized. Instead, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for what he'd lost, gratitude for having had it at all, and a tentative hope for what might still be possible. Daniel stayed for 2 weeks, helping with ranch work and reconnecting with his brother. Before he left, he pulled Quinn aside. "You're healing," he said simply. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see that." Quinn nodded. Slowly. "Sarah would want you to be happy, you know. She'd like Madeline. It's not that simple." Daniel clasped his shoulder. "It never is. But don't let fear stop you from living again." After Daniel's departure, Quinn found himself considering his brother's words. On the next Wednesday, instead of working on ranch projects, he suggested to Madeline that they ride out to the spring in the north pasture for a picnic lunch. "That sounds lovely," she agreed, clearly surprised by the suggestion. They sat beside the clear, bubbling spring, sharing the food Madeline had brought and watching the clouds drift across the vast Montana sky. Quinn found himself telling her stories about Emma, her first words, how she'd love to help him with the horses, the way she'd laugh when he tossed her into the air. "She sounds wonderful," Madeline said softly. "Thank you for sharing her with me." "I haven't talked about her in so long," Quinn admitted. "It hurt too much." And now, it still hurts. But there's something else too, good memories, not just the loss. Madeline reached out and took his hand. That's how it should be. They sat in silence for a moment, hands linked, before Quinn spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said about wanting to build something lasting. She looked at him questioningly. This ranch, he continued, gesturing at the land around them, it's more than I can manage alone. And I don't want to be alone anymore. Madeline's eyes widened as she understood what he was saying. Quinn, I'm not asking from loneliness, he clarified quickly. I'm asking because in these months of working beside you, watching you carry nails and build fences and deliver calves, I've come to admire your strength and your heart. I'm asking because when you're not here, I find myself counting the days until Wednesday. He turned to face her fully. Madeline Owens, I never expected to feel this way again. I never thought I could. But I care for you deeply, and if you might feel something similar, she stopped his words with a gentle hand on his cheek. I do, she said simply. I have for some time now. Quinn covered her hand with his own. Your father's store will figure it out, she assured him. One step at a time. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey, familiar and new all at once. As they rode back to the ranch hand in hand, Quinn looked at the fence line they had built together months ago, straight and true across the landscape. It seemed a fitting symbol for what they were beginning, something built with care, designed to endure. That fall, with the golden light of autumn painting the hills around them, Quinn and Madeline were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Mr. Owens gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes, having agreed to train a young couple from town to eventually take over the mercantile. I want you to be happy, he had told Madeline when she worried about leaving him. And I've never seen you as happy as you are with him. Daniel served as Quinn's best man, his pride in his brother's journey evident in his beaming smile. The townspeople who had once whispered about the silent, solitary newcomer now celebrated the union of two people who had found each other when neither was looking. As winter settled over the ranch, Quinn and Madeline created a home together. The cabin that had once seemed so empty now echoed with conversation and occasional laughter. They worked side by side through the cold months, planning for spring and the future they would build together. One evening, as they sat before the fire, Quinn reading aloud from a book while Madeline mended a shirt, he paused mid-sentence. "What is it?" she asked, looking up from her work. "I was just thinking about that first day," he said. "When you brought the nails and started working on the fence without asking permission." She smiled at the memory. "You looked so offended." "I was," he admitted with a chuckle. "This stubborn woman invading my solitude, hammering away at my carefully constructed isolation. And now—" Quinn set the book aside and took her hand. "Now I thank God every day that you were stubborn enough to keep coming back, Wednesday after Wednesday, until I remembered how to live again." Madeline leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly on his shoulder. "We built something good, didn't we? Not just fences." "We did," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "And we're just getting started." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the land in a blanket of white. Inside, the warmth of their home stood against the winter cold, a testament to what can be built when two people work side by side. Through silence and words, through grief and healing, through all the seasons of a life reclaimed and shared.